This is the Detroit Sports Podcast Network.
What's up, jerks?
Manning retired.
Which one?
Both.
I like kickers.
Put him on the board. Hausch Mazzoli. Got it. Championship.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Nerds, brought to you by the Fan Up Network on the Detroit Sports Podcast Network. As always, I am Jason Jarvie. Follow me on Twitter at Jarvie the King, and it's another week to talk fantasy football. I hope you're all ready. I have some NFL news to pass on to you that could affect us fantasy-wise. Colin Kaepernick came out, spoke to reporters for the first time in 6 months, and said he's happy to be here and looking forward to training camp. Now, I think this is actually a decent sign, because Colin Kaepernick under Chip Kelly, I think that's the right fit. When he was under Jim Harbaugh, it was a match made in heaven, because Harbaugh is a quarterback guru. Last season under Jim Tomsula really didn't know what he was doing on the team. And Chip Kelly, I really, when he went to San Francisco initially, I thought that Colin Kaepernick would really fit that offense. Now, I think he may have had other plans. I think he sees himself more as a traditional quarterback, but we all know he's made his living through his feet. So I think it could be good for the 49ers if he actually wants to be in San Francisco. But he will have to win the starting job from Blaine Gabbert to start. So keep an eye on that throughout training camp and into preseason. Next bit of news, the Rams signed all their top picks, including Jared Goff. I mean, that was bound to happen, obviously. And Jared Goff still remains more than likely a backup, and you really shouldn't draft him unless you're just looking for a flyer to spend on somebody. I wouldn't suggest using him as your main backup unless you have one of those top guys as a Aaron Rodgers or a Tom Brady. Otherwise, you should just leave him alone. Up next, Andrew Luck. He was commenting on his upcoming, probably record-breaking contract negotiations. He's going to be the highest paid quarterback in the league pretty soon here. But more than likely, I don't think they're going to reach an agreement by this summer. And by him saying that the negotiations aren't going to weigh on him, if they actually go into the season without having a deal, I think that definitely bodes well for fantasy owners for Andrew Luck, because guys normally perform their best when they're trying to get paid. I mean, money motivates everybody. So having him trying to compete to get the most money that he can, I think that's great for fantasy owners. And I'd still be wary of Andrew Luck for the beginning part of the season, but at some point this year, I believe he's going to be a top 5 quarterback. The Broncos, just like the Rams, they agreed with their quarterback that they took in the first round, Paxton Lynch. Now, I've spoken about Paxton Lynch a little bit, and I'm not really sure of what the situation is in Denver, and I think Mark Sanchez is likely going to get the start at the beginning of the season, but they obviously saw something in Lynch to draft him as high as they did, and over other quarterbacks that I think were actually going to be better than him. They say that he fits the scheme that they're looking to run. So definitely keep an eye on Paxton Lynch. If he isn't the starter, obviously it doesn't really have a whole lot of value in drafts. If you are in a keeper league, he may have a little bit of later value. Also in the news, very interesting story coming out of Baltimore. Trent Richardson has been a big disappointment pretty much ever since he was drafted number 3 overall. He had a decent rookie season with the Browns, but after he was shipped to Indianapolis in his second season, you just kind of were waiting for him to take that next step. And I'm not sure if he's ever going to make that jump and be a top running back. But apparently he thinks otherwise. He went on, in an interview earlier this week, he thinks that his career is going to end with him in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. He said that people have always written him off and that he was dealing with a lot of personal issues in previous seasons, and that now he's just ready and focused to play football. And I'm not going to believe him just yet. He's going to have to show me on the field that he's a different player, that he's focused, and I mean, it's a pretty decent situation that he's in Baltimore, but I think Justin Forsett definitely gets the nod as starter there, and Richardson's going to have to beat out a couple other guys. The running back situation isn't really set in Baltimore, as I've covered before, but Trent Richardson, he's got a lot of work to do to catch up. To finish up the news segment, out of Tennessee, they're saying that the running back rotation isn't really set. You know, they went out this season, they got DeMarco Murray, even though they had a host of running backs to really just plug in wherever. Terry Robisky, who's their offensive coordinator, came out, said that nothing's set in stone, that he believes that whatever we have to do, whatever is necessary, we have to do whatever is necessary to win, and they're not committed to anybody. So while DeMarco Murray is likely going to be the starter there, he's not committed to any one person. And they spent a second-round draft pick on the Alabama running back Derrick Henry. So I think this is it's definitely worrying for fantasy owners, because if you're going to DeMarco Murray is when he's healthy and when he's a starter, obviously that he wasn't a starter in Philadelphia last season, you saw what he was able to do in Dallas. Now I know some of that is a product of that Dallas offensive line. So I think he's going to have to figure out how to run behind this Titans line now. Otherwise, he may be in a pretty short leash, and DeMarco Murray may burn fantasy football players again this season. Now I'm going to start my Around the League segment, where I go around to each conference and every division and tell you about the players that you should be looking at on these teams. We've already done the NFC and AFC North, and last week we started on the NFC South, so we'll round out the South this week by looking over the AFC South, starting with the team who won the division last year, the Houston Texans, who definitely got hot later in the season and were riding the high that their defense had, but they just didn't have a quarterback that could take them over the top. And I think that's what they hoped they got in Brock Osweiler. They paid him a ton of money to leave the Super Bowl winning Broncos to come to the Houston Texans and hopefully fulfill they've never really had a solid quarterback. Matt Schaub was pretty decent for a couple seasons, but he wasn't a franchise quarterback. And for what it's worth, Brock Osweiler may not be a franchise quarterback, but he left a really good situation in Denver. Obviously, he got paid a ton of money, but he definitely has some top talent to work with here in Houston. It's gonna be a work in progress, and you're gonna have to watch him. I wouldn't really see him as a starting quarterback, but he's a decent backup. At running back, they went out and spent a ton of money in free agency this year. They let go of Arian Foster, who was a top fantasy running back for a long time, but he was always injured. So they went out, they got Lamar Miller. He was a free agent from the Dolphins, who last season, the writing was kind of on the wall for him that the Dolphins didn't want him back. So he went out, and I think he came into a really good situation here in Houston. I think that with all the weapons they have, I think Lamar Miller is a really good regular running back, and also he has the ability to be a pass catcher out of the backfield. in this system, I really see Lamar Miller having the potential to be a top 10 running back, and he's likely going to be drafted that way this year. At wide receiver, they have DeAndre Hopkins, who had a breakout season last year. I think that's he propelled himself to the levels of Antonio Brown and Jordy Nelson, and he's going to be drafted as such. And he didn't really have a ton of help last year. Nate Washington was probably his main competition at wide receiver, and you saw the Texans address that in the draft this year. They went out in the first round and got the Notre Dame wide receiver Will Fuller, who I think he'll be a pretty good complement to DeAndre Hopkins, because Hopkins, he has a bit of speed, but he's more of a solid route runner, and he's going to be the red zone threat, where Will Fuller kind of gives you that deep threat. He's a burner, and you're just going to tell him to run a streak, and he'll stretch the field, which this offense has really lacked. They also went and spent another high draft pick on Ohio State, quarterback turned wide receiver Braxton Miller, who I'm really excited about. Braxton Miller, because I think he can do. Will Fuller he's a wide receiver, and there's no doubt about that. Braxton Miller, I categorize him more as a weapon. I look at him and I see a better Percy Harvin, and I think he's only a rookie. He hasn't played a down of NFL football, so it'll be interesting to see what he can do. But what I saw at Ohio State over the years is that he's just a flat out gamer. He has insane moves. If you remember from last season, he had this one spin move where it looked straight out of Madden 95, where you press the O button, and it was ridiculous. So I'll be interested to see what he can do. And then they also, in previous years, they spent a high draft pick on Jalen Strong, who hasn't really done a whole lot up until now, but he has shown flashes, and it'll be interesting to see if he can capitalize on Brock Osweiler and having a better quarterback there. At tight end, it's kind of a toss-up right there right now. They have CJ Fedorowicz and Ryan Griffin, and neither of those guys have really solidified the number one spot. Since Owen Daniels left, they don't really have that number one option. And with all the weapons that they have, I'm not really sure if a Houston Texan tight end is who you want to be depending on to be your starting tight end. So I really wouldn't worry about either of those guys. If one of them does end up breaking out, they're going to be on the waiver wire, and then you can deal with it at that point. So to wrap up the Texans, Brock Osweiler, I see him more going in the mid rounds of draft. He's a mid to low end backup quarterback. If you have a lower tier starting quarterback, Brock Osweiler might be a decent pickup, because he's going to be feeding the ball to some really talented wide receivers. At running back, Lamar Miller, he definitely should be drafted like a top 10 running back. And so I'd see him going, I could see him as early as the first round, depending on how many teams you have in your league. But more likely than not, I would see him going in the middle part of the second round. And the backup running back there, Alfred Blue, the only reason that I would draft him is if you wanted to get him as a handcuff for Lamar Miller. He shouldn't be more than a late round ad at that. But more than if you don't have Lamar Miller, I would just let Alfred Blue kind of sit there, because he hadn't taken over the starting job when Aaron Foster went down. So what gives you that feeling that he could come in for Lamar Miller? DeAndre Hopkins is a top 3 to top 5 wide receiver. I could see him going in some first rounds, but again, I see him more as a mid to late in second round. If you are able to get DeAndre Hopkins in the third round, I think I would consider myself lucky, because you got yourself a really, really good wide receiver. Will Fuller, I would look for him around the 7th or 8th round. Because he's a rookie, I think he's going to have some growing pains. I wouldn't want to depend on him as my backup wide receiver, as my number 2 wide receiver. Will Fuller is a guy that I'd want to have sitting on my bench for when he blows up. Then I can either put him in my starting lineup or he's trade bait. Braxton Miller, I would look for him more in the mid to late rounds of draft. He's an interesting guy. I'm likely going to take flyers on him in a lot of the drafts that I'm in this year, and I'll treat him as such. But there's also the possibility he could just do nothing. And Jalen Strong, if you're looking for depth wide receiver late in the draft, he'd be an interesting pickup. But more than likely, he's going to go undrafted. Just like both of the tight ends, there's a ton of other tight ends out there that I would rather have than gambling on CJ Fedorowicz or Ryan Griffin. So that wraps up the Texans. The next team in the AFC South is the Indianapolis Colts, which is a team that I think had a high ceiling last year, but just did not pan out at all due to injuries and just bad luck, really. And that's not a pun, but it is exactly what happened to their quarterback. Andrew Luck, going into last season, he was rated almost as high as Aaron Rodgers. And when it came to draft time, everyone really said, Aaron Rodgers, Andrew Luck, you really can't go wrong. And I made the mistake of saying, Andrew Luck, he's younger, he has a lot more deep threats, and I think that he has what it takes. They got Andre Johnson last year, they got Frank Gore, that he's going to be able to take it to the next level and really be that number 1 quarterback. Where Aaron Rodgers, he didn't have Jordy Nelson, and Aaron Rodgers still finished with a top 10 quarterback in the top 10 quarterback in scoring, and Andrew Luck ended up getting hurt, and even before he was hurt, he just wasn't himself. He wasn't on at all. Andre Johnson didn't really help him. The T.Y. Hilton had a down year, and Frank Gore, I mean, he was okay, but did not help him as much as I thought it was going to be. So, as I said in a previous episode, where I'm going to predict Andrew Luck, he's going to have a bounce back season, but I think it's going to be a slow start for him because he's still coming back from injury, and it's going to take some time for him to really just get back into the groove of things. He's got a somewhat of a tough schedule to begin with. I really see them going 4-4 in the beginning of the season, but when it comes time to compete, Andrew Luck will be there, and he's going to be a pretty solid fantasy quarterback for you. Running back Frank Gore, even though he's another year older, has been extremely dependable. I see him as he's a low-end number 2 running back at this stage in his career right now. There's the potential where he could have a pretty decent game every now and then, but I don't want to use him as any more than I'd really rather have him as a rotation guy at my number 2 running back. Choose between this guy and Frank Gore, because Frank Gore is, while dependable, he's not going to win you a ton of games. And behind him, there really isn't much. They signed Jordan Todman and Robert Turbin, which both of those guys, if Frank Gore goes down, there's going to be a lot of other options out there that I would rather pick up over those 2 guys. At wide receiver, T.Y. Hilton, as I said before, he kind of had a down year last year. Obviously, if Andrew Luck would have been healthy the entire year, that would have helped him a lot, because he had, Matt Hasselbeck, who can barely throw it 20 yards to him. So with Andrew Luck back, it's definitely going to help T.Y. Hilton's value. And it should help all of the wide receivers' value, because they do have some talented guys there. Dante Moncrief is the number 2, who I really like. I kind of compare him to a Pierre Garçon. He does have speed, but he's also a route runner. So that's great for Andrew Luck, gives him an option. And I see Dante Moncrief having a bounce back year along with Andrew Luck. And then you had the receiver that they drafted last year, Philip Dorsett, who is just an extreme burner. He didn't really have a whole lot of development last year, similar to why T.Y. Hilton didn't do well. He didn't have a guy who could just throw them the ball 40 yards and have a big play. Philip Dorsett is a boomer bust player. So with a healthy Andrew Luck, Philip Dorsett will get better, but he's going to be the type of player where he's dependent on the big play. He's going to have games where he has, 0 to 1 catch for 17 yards, and there's going to be games where he has 4 catches for 130 yards and a touchdown with a 60 or 70 yard touchdown on that game. It's just going to be hard to predict when that's going to happen. And then at tight end, Coby Fleener, they let him go in free agency, who, ever since Andrew Luck's been in the league, he's had his former tight end from college with him, and he's been that dependable rock. But I think what they see in Dwayne Allen, they see a lot of potential, which is why I think they probably felt okay letting Coby Fleener go. So Dwayne Allen, I'm not predicting a huge season from him, but he could be a surprising backup tight end on teams. So to recap the Colts, Andrew Luck, he's rated as a top quarterback, and he's going to be in the top 5 at least. I think he's going to have a slow start, but you need to draft him accordingly. I'd see him going somewhere in the 4th or 5th rounds, depending on how your league rates quarterbacks and how they score for you. If you're in a league where touchdowns and quarterbacks score you a ton of points, he could go earlier. But in the majority of leagues, I see him going somewhere maybe in the later part of the 3rd round and into the 4th and 5th. Frank Gore, just because he is a starting quarterback, is going to go higher than he probably should. I see him going somewhere in the 4th or 5th round. If somebody's reaching for a starting quarterback or a starting running back, which I really wouldn't advise, there's probably a wide receiver there at that point that I'd rather have. But Frank Gore, somewhere in the 4th and 5th round, is where I would take him. Jordan Todman, Robert Turbin, I wouldn't even bother drafting those guys. As I said, there's going to be, if Gore's down, there's going to be other guys who I'd rather have. And, if you have the space, just in a toss-up, I like Jordan Todman. I think he's been okay, but I really suggest don't drafting either of those guys. For the wide receivers, T.Y. Hilton, I think he's going to go as high as number 3 because in the 3rd round because of who his quarterback is and the possibility of him having those gigantic games. Because even though Hilton is a boomer bust player, kind of like Philip Dorsett, he's also the number 1 wide receiver, and he's Andrew Luck wants to get him the ball. So I see him going somewhere, probably the early to late 3rd, and somewhere in there in the 4th round. Dante Moncrief, I'd say, 5th or 6th round. And Philip Dorsett is more of a later round player. The majority of the passes are going to go to Hilton, Moncrief, and then even Dwayne Allen's going to get more than Dorsett. But Dorsett, look for him in the late rounds. He, maybe let him go undrafted, let him sit in the waiver wire. But he has a lot of raw talent, and he's so fast. So I would look for Dorsett in the later rounds of drafts if you are going to take him, because he's a good guy to just stash on your bench. Just in case somebody has Andrew Luck and Dorsett. If Dorsett does seem to turn around and the guy needs a wide receiver, you might be able to turn that into some decent value. And Dwayne Allen, at the moment, I think he's a backup tight end. He hasn't really proved that he can be that starting tight end for you in fantasy. But he's a late round pickup if you're looking for a backup. If you do draft a backup tight end, he could be interesting. But if there's other players that you could stash away on your team, I'd go before Dwayne Allen. So either late round or let Dwayne Allen just go undrafted. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll wrap up the AFC South. You're listening to the Fantasy Nerds on the Detroit Sports Podcast Network. The Fantasy Nerd Show is sponsored by the Fan Up Network. They've developed the ultimate fantasy football app. It's a one-stop shop for everything you need. You can track teams and scores across multiple platforms, get latest injury and player news, and access to expert advice. See the hot trends with waiver pickups and drops. It has everything you need to manage all your fantasy football teams. Android users can get the app in the Play Store, and an iPhone version is now available in the App Store. Go to fanupnetwork.com to learn more and follow them on Twitter at fanupnetwork. Welcome back to the Fantasy Nerds. Next up in the AFC South, we have the Jacksonville Jaguars, who they're a very, very interesting team. Their record doesn't show it, but they have a lot of potential and a lot of talent on that team. You saw last year kind of the emergence of their offense. Blake Bortles, their quarterback, who the Jaguars haven't been able to catch a break at quarterback, I'd say really until, since Mark Brunell left the team. They've went through so many, David Garrard, Chad Henne, they draft Blaine Gabbert, he doesn't pan out. Blake Bortles he really, came into his own last year, and, he's going to be rated in the top 10 of the majority of rankings for quarterbacks. And I think he has the ability and the weapons on offense to even be a top 5 or even higher quarterback. He has that potential. So Blake Bortles is a guy that you're going to want to watch. If you let those other quarterbacks go earlier in your draft, you let Andrew Luck, Aaron Rodgers, Cam Newton, don't sit too long on Blake Bortles, because he has the ability to be, he has the weapons to be the best fantasy quarterback in football. And one of the weapons that helps him at running back, TJ Yeldon, is a guy that I loved coming out of college last year. I would have loved for my Detroit Lions to draft him, but unfortunately, Jaguars snatched him up. And he had a quietly good season last year. And I think coming into this year is year 2. I think the Jaguars get a little bit better. And you're going to see another step forward with TJ Yeldon. The one downside is they went out and signed free agent running back Chris Ivory, who, everyone I think kind of thought his career was pretty much over. But he went to the Jets last season and had a pretty solid season. So it does raise some question marks for fantasy players, because you're going to have to play the, TJ Yeldon or Chris Ivory. Who's going to have the better week? And hopefully through training camp and with free agency and preseason games, we'll have a better idea of what the Jaguars are actually going to do, because I would hope that by the time week 1 comes around, one of those guys is the number 1 option. So you can go forward playing one of those guys and know that the other guy is just a backup option. They spent a high draft pick on TJ Yeldon. I think he's the starter right now, but you can't deny what Chris Ivory did. So, watch them throughout the offseason and see what happens. And then you also have Denard Robinson and Jonas Gray on the team. Denard he's a flash in the pan. He's gonna be flashy every now and then, but if you're gonna draft him, you're not drafting him until late. And Jonas Gray, even though he had the flash in New England, when he came to Jacksonville, he just didn't really have it. So either of those guys, I wouldn't be surprised if they go undrafted. But then the meat of the weapons that Jacksonville has is at wide receiver, and it starts with their top 2 guys, Allen Robinson and Allen Hurns. And at times you can say that they're very similar, but Allen Robinson is head and shoulders above right now the number 1 guy. You look at what the Lions had in Calvin Johnson and Golden Tate. It's kind of a similar situation. You have one guy who is your big option that teams have to worry about. And then you have your second option where sometimes guys just, they forget about him. So Allen Robinson, he had a ton of catches, a ton of yards, a ton of touchdowns last year. And I don't really see, outside of an injury, why that's going to stop. Allen Robinson is still going to be, he's a top 10 wide receiver at best. And at best, he could be somewhere in that top 10. And Allen Hurns has the ability to be in the same conversation, but it's just going to be a matter of Blake Bortles spreading the ball around. I'm not sure if there's going to be enough for both of these guys to really succeed as a number one option. So that's why I give the nod to Allen Robinson. Allen Hurns is still going to be good. I was looking at his stats from last year, and a lot of what he did was touchdown dependent. So that is something that does worry me, because whenever a guy scores the majority of his points on touchdowns, you worry about them producing that. If a guy gets 10 touchdowns one year, you can't rely on somebody doing the same thing. You want your wide receiver to be more balanced. You want them to be getting their points through receptions and yards, with the touchdown sprinkled in here and there to really just give you the edge. So Allen Hurns, he's probably a high to mid-level wide receiver 2 at this point. And the other thing that I discussed in previous episodes, Allen Hurns has got a big contract extension, so that does worry me. When guys get that money, they could just be, say, hey, whatever, I got the money. Behind those guys, they do have a host of wide receivers. They have Marquise Lee, Rashad Green. They signed Aurelius Ben, and all those guys, like on offenses that have really good quarterbacks who are good at spreading the ball around, these guys are going to have a good game here or there, but more than likely, I don't really want to draft these guys, because if you are drafting them, you're essentially you're using them for depth and hoping that one of those guys breaks out, or if one of the two Allens gets hurt, then Marquise Lee or Rashad Green steps up and is able to produce like them. Then you could use them as trade bait. But I'm not touching those guys until later rounds in the draft, because they're making their money. Blake Bortles is making his money on Allen Robinson and Allen Hurns. And also, you can't forget about their tight end, Julius Thomas, who he was hurt a bunch last year, but you could see that he was making a difference on that offense. And while Thomas has had injury problems pretty much throughout his entire career, if it can somehow stay healthy an entire year, it's just going to be even better for Blake Bortles and the entire offense, because Julius Thomas is going to be a threat that defenses are going to have to worry about. The one thing that I would worry about if Julius Thomas does come back to somewhat of his form when he was in Denver, I might worry for Allen Robinson or Allen Hurns, more for Allen Hurns, because he's so touchdown dependent. Julius Thomas is going to be a huge red zone threat, and he could eat up touchdowns that Hurns could be getting. So definitely watch his situation, see how he's doing. But Thomas is a very good tight end option when healthy. And then they also have Mercedes Lewis, who he's been there for seemingly forever. But with Julius Thomas healthy, you're not going to see a lot from Lewis. You're going to let him sit on the waiver wire until Julius Thomas gets hurt. So to wrap up the Jaguars, Blake Bortles, I'd see him in the 4th or 5th round. He's that second tier of quarterbacks. He's after the Aaron Rodgers and Andrew Lucks and Cam Newtons, but he's in that second tier. He deserves to be considered to be a starting quarterback in fantasy leagues, and draft him accordingly. TJ Yeldon, both TJ Yeldon and Chris Ivory, I see them as low-end number 2 running backs in the moment, unless one of them breaks out and establishes themselves as the main option there in Jacksonville. But until that happens, I really see them as running back 2 options, both of them. Yeldon may have a little bit more value in PPR leagues because he is a pass-catching threat out of the backfield. But I'd see them... I wouldn't draft him until the 5th or 6th round to start, and that would be TJ Yeldon. Chris Ivory, I'd wait another round or 2. Somebody's likely going to, reach up and snatch him, but that's not going to be me. I don't want to depend my starting running back spot on a guy who's splitting time. Allen Robinson, I could see him going as high as in the 2nd round. He definitely has the ability, and if people are drafting wide receivers, it's not unheard of, in the end of the 2nd round. But more than likely, you'll see him slide somewhere in the 3rd round. If you're lucky, you might be able to pick him up in the 4th round, just because he's what team he's on. People may be like, he's on the Jacksonville Jaguars, and he's not a name yet. Until he really, comes out and does something amazing. So I'd see 3rd, 4th round for Allen Robinson. Allen Hurns, I'd see somewhere in the 5th or 6th round. He has the ability to go higher, but that's where I'd want to pick up Allen Hurns. Maybe even a little bit later, just because the possibility that he is so touchdown dependent. So maybe somewhere between the 5th and 7th rounds for Allen Hurns. The other guys, Marquise Lee, Rashad Green, Aurelius Ben, they're really no more than late round flyers. I like Rashad Green. He's a 2nd-year guy out of Florida State. He's a burner, and I kind of think Marquise Lee is a similar type wide receiver, but I'd rather bet my money on the younger guy. And Julius Thomas, if healthy, he is a top 10. He has a top 10 tight end potential. But be wary if you do draft Julius Thomas, you're gonna want to have a second tight end option on your team, and you're gonna want to have a decent tight end option because if you draft Julius Thomas and then draft a scrub tight end to be your backup, you're gonna be stuck with that guy. And you're going to be automatically losing that position every single week. So be wary of Julius Thomas, but draft him as a top 10 tight end. And the last team in the AFC South that I'm going to cover, the Tennessee Titans. And always these bottom feeder teams in divisions, they always seem so bad. And I don't see a lot. There's so much confusion on the teams themselves. The only real position that I don't see confusion at for the Titans is Marcus Mariota, who they drafted in the 1st round last year. Had some injury problems that kept him out of the latter part of the season. But Mariota has the potential to be. I'd put him as a low end backup in fantasy leagues. With what he can do with his legs. And I think if some of his receiving options can develop, and if he can find them a little bit more often, he could have some pretty solid games. You saw him have some bigger games as a rookie. He just wasn't able to keep it up. So it's going to be his progress this year is going to depend on what everybody else around him is going to doing. And the biggest question is on that team, though, is the running back situation. They have a ton of running backs who, at one point or another, have been linked to starting positions. They went out and they got DeMarco Murray this year, who everyone knows what happened last year on Philadelphia, coming from Dallas. Now DeMarco Murray's on Tennessee, and we think that he's the number 1 guy, but it's just a big question mark. They went out in the draft in the 2nd round. They took the Derrick Henry, who whether DeMarco Murray is the clear-cut number 1 guy, Derrick Henry is gonna have to eat into his production at some point this season. If they just let Henry sit on the bench all year, that's a wasted pick, and that's a dumb front office movement. So Derrick Henry's going to get some play. Yeah, I don't think you can discount Antonio Andrews, who was their leading rusher last year. And then they have David Cobb and Bishop Sankey and Dexter McCluster. It's a gigantic question mark all over that running back situation. That's like the largest running back by committee that I've ever seen. And more likely than not, not all those guys are gonna be on the team at the beginning of the year. The guys that I'd see being cut, Bishop Sankey is likely the first guy who's gonna be off of that team. He's been a gigantic bust since he got there. And then it's going to be a toss-up between Dexter McCluster and David Cobb. David Cobb is the guy that they brought in last year. He was hurt for the majority of the year, and they thought that he might be able to compete for a starting job. And on the other hand, you have Dexter McCluster, who is more of a weapon. You can use him out of the backfield. You might be able to line him up as a wide receiver, and he's also a decent kick returner. So, I mean, the depth chart is likely going to go DeMarco Murray, Derrick Henry, Antonio Andrews, and then one of those three guys is going to make the team. If you ask me, I'd probably pick Dexter McCluster, but it might be David Cobb. But it's such a mess there. DeMarco Murray, he's likely going to be the number one option, and I'd see him as a low-end number 2 running back until he can prove that he can actually run behind a line that isn't the Dallas Cowboys. And then for Derrick Henry, I'd spend a mid-round pick because he definitely had the potential in Alabama. He does remind me a little bit of Trent Richardson, which is worrisome. But, I'm not going to count him out until he actually has his, first rush as an NFL player. And Antonio Andrews, I might spend a late pick on him. He's the kind of guy where you're just looking for players to stash on your bench that could have potential if, Tennessee decides to trade Andrews, or if injuries just happen. Andrews could see himself as the starting running back once again. So very strange. Make sure to watch that throughout the offseason. Now the weapons that I was talking about developing, it's really in the wide receiver, and it's going to start with Dorial Green-Beckham, who last year he wasn't really expected to make a lot of noise last year because they had some more veteran wide receivers, but because of injuries, he was thrust into play. So it's Dorial Green-Beckham. He looks like a prototypical number 1 wide receiver on teams. He's definitely had a little bit. He has a lot of raw talent, and if he can develop this year, he could be a really, really good fantasy wide receiver. He's a huge option. He could be a big red zone threat. It's all going to depend on him, though. They have a host of other smaller, quick wide receivers who are going to eat into. They're going to get their yards. They're going to get their touchdowns. They're not going to be great, but they're worth having on your team. And that's Justin Hunter and Kendall Wright. They've both shined at times, but both have trouble staying on the field. So keep that in mind when it comes to draft day, and kind of let them fall a little bit. And then they went out and signed Rashard Matthews from the Dolphins, who he was, at times he looked like a number 1 option, but last year Jarvis Landry really took over that job in Miami, and Rashard Matthews kind of became an afterthought here on Tennessee. If Marcus Mariota can if he really develops and starts progressing through his reads, Matthews could be a really interesting option, especially with the injury history of Justin Hunter and Kendall Wright. He could be that number 2 option and really thrive in that offense. The number 1 receiving option last year really was Delanie Walker, which here's a guy who, again, he's an older guy. You're thinking that he's probably coming towards the end of his career, but then he comes out last year, has a pretty solid season. Gets a ton of touchdowns. I would be wary again because this is a guy that was dependent on touchdowns. if he can have the same kind of production this year. But Delaney Walker, more likely than not, he's going to be right around the top 10, maybe right outside. But if he does get the touchdown potential, the touchdowns again this year, it bumps him into the top 10, closer to the top 5. I'm not saying he's a top 5 tight end, but last year he definitely had times when he was producing like it. So to wrap up the Tennessee Titans, Marcus Mariota, a low-end backup. I look for him in the later part of the middle rounds, even into the later rounds of the draft. I would definitely wait on Marcus Mariota. For DeMarco Murray, as a low-end right now, running back 2, I'd look for him somewhere in the 4th to 5th round. There's going to be people who jump on him. I'm just not sold on what he can do. He's going to be, even though he is the number 1 option right now, there's so many people behind him that are they're right there. They're gonna step up. It's in Philadelphia last year, he had Ryan Matthews and Darren Sproles behind him, and I think you can argue that he has better running backs now behind him that are ready to pounce when he doesn't perform. So I would look somewhere 4th, 5th round for DeMarco Murray. Derrick Henry, just because he is such a highly rated rookie, I'd look somewhere in the 7th to 8th round for Derrick Henry. I don't want to jump up much higher on a guy who isn't even the starter right now. Antonio Andrews, look for him in the mid to late rounds. Stash him as a handcuff type player, or that guy that you stash on your team in hopes that he's going to get you value at some point in the season. All the wide receivers, they aren't really high round draft picks. Dorial Green, Beckham, Justin Hunter, Kendall Wright, they're all kind of, you draft them probably somewhere in the somewhere between the 6th and 10th round for all those guys. I wouldn't blame anybody for drafting one of them before the other. The only one that I wouldn't want to draft somewhere in that span would be Rashard Matthews. I'll leave him more for a later round pickup. And then Delaney Walker, I'd put him somewhere in the 8th to 10th round for him, because he has the potential to be a really good tight end, but being touchdown dependent, I don't want to draft him as a top 5 tight end. And that wraps up the AFC South. And to wrap up this episode of the Fantasy Nerds, we'll end with the King's Decree. The King's Decree is where I give you a bunch of polled predictions in every episode, and we'll check later on in the season to see just how right I was or how wrong I was. And this week, I've been predicting lately that of guys who are going to do good. So now I'm going to finally put my money where my mouth is and predict somebody to have a bad season. I don't like to predict somebody having a bad season, but it's you got to do it as a fantasy expert. So my prediction, David Johnson, Arizona running back, he's going to finish outside the top 10 in running backs this year. In most rankings right now, you see him as really in the top 3 of running backs. You see Adrian Peterson, you see Devontae Freeman, and then David Johnson is right in that conversation. And we've seen in recent years a lot of top 10 running backs finishing outside of the top 10. You just go back to last year, Eddie Lacy, C.J. Anderson, all these guys who were projected to be, great running backs, just not performing. And I don't like what I see from David Johnson. And really, it might be a product of what the Cardinals do. Andre Ellington was a high, everyone had high hopes for him, and he just never panned out. And I kind of see the similar thing with David Johnson. And I can see, people like his ability as an all-purpose back, but I just don't see him as being like even a top 5 running back. he definitely has the potential to be in that top 10 conversation. But I definitely see him taking a step back this season. He reminds me a lot of C.J. Anderson. In his rookie season, he came on later in the year, and then he struggled when he got the full reins to the ship. So I think David Johnson this year, he's still going to be okay, but it's going to be a step back because they're going to depend on him to be the number one guy. And I think in that, in the NFC West, going up against teams with really good defenses, it's gonna help. Going up against St. Louis and Seattle twice a year is gonna be tough for him. So David Johnson, book it. He's gonna finish outside the top 10, and that is the King's decree. That'll do it for this episode of the Fantasy Nerds. Next week, I'll have more football news for you. We've covered the North and the South. I think it's time to go West, so we'll cover the NFC West division next week, and I'll have another King's Decree. But until next week, I am Jason Jarvie. Follow me on Twitter at JarvieTheKing. Big thanks to the Fan Up Network, who sponsors this show, and we'll see you next week, nerds.